Okay, so welcome everyone. It's my absolute pleasure to introduce the 8th Q-Mare seminar presenter, Dr. Dylan Davis. So Dylan is a National Science Foundation postdoctoral research fellow at Columbia University's Climate School. And he specializes in archaeological remote sensing and geospatial analysis. He earned his PhD in anthropology at the Pennsylvania State University. And there he explored the relationship between human settlement strategies and socio-ecological change on Madagascar's southwest coast. And it's there that he developed really a novel framework for conducting settlement archaeology that involved a multi-proxy approach to understanding behavioral drivers and feedbacks of human settlement choices on socio-ecological systems. And Dylan's current postdoctoral research builds on this work on his PhD and focuses on the relationship between different subsistence economies and socio-ecological sustainability also in Madagascar. And that's going to be the main focus, I believe, of his talk today, which is titled Archaeology of Sustainability, Lessons about Coastal Land Use Strategies from Southwest Madagascar. Thank you very much, Dylan, for giving us the time to tell us about your research. It's an honor to have you. We're really looking forward to hearing more about your work. So please go ahead.
Thank you, Aaron, for that introduction. Let me just share my screen here. Is that visible to everyone?
Looks good to me, Dylan. Thanks. Go ahead.
Perfect. All right. So thank you for having me here to talk to you about some of the research that I've been doing. As Aaron already introduced, my name is Dylan Davis. I'm currently a postdoctoral fellow at Columbia's Climate School at Columbia University. And what I'll be talking to you about today is really some of the lessons that my research team and I have been learning through the research that I've been conducting with a variety of collaborators about how coastal land use strategies and intertidal zones, how we can learn about ways in which people and communities have lived sustainably and the kinds of practices that have worked to modify environments in sustainable and resilient ways using Southwest Madagascar as a particular case study in this instance. And so to kind of begin, I want to kind of frame this in the context of modern issues and crises. And the climate change crisis is one of which that most people here will be aware of, and that is becoming an increasingly problematic issue that today's society and future societies will have to contend with. The UN Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change recently released this quite extensive report that focuses on the state of the world and its risk from climate-related disasters. And among the many impacts to the world that climate change and subsequent environmental instability is leaving is resulting in these major increases in highly vulnerable populations across the world, as you can kind of see in this image here. Large parts of the global south, Madagascar included, are highly at risk from various aspects of climate change and its impacts on the world, whether it comes from forced migration of communities because places are no longer tenable to live in, lack of food resources due to widespread crop failure and famine, lack of access to fresh water, all kinds of things that are causing populations to have to pick up and move or go elsewhere. Otherwise, they are at increased risk of all sorts of problematic aspects. Madagascar, though, is interesting because it provides a particular case study where climate is not a recent issue for communities that are living here. This has actually posed severe challenges for communities on Madagascar for millennia, as long as they've really been present on the island. And so this offers an opportunity to improve our understanding of the different factors that drive people to and from different areas and the ways in which people have successfully or not successfully coped with climate change for hundreds, if not thousands of years in the past. And especially when we look into the archaeological record and the ethnographic record and try to examine traditional approaches to dealing with climate-related issues, this has the potential to make impacts to contemporary communities by helping to shed light on how people have successfully dealt with similar situations before. But first, to give a little bit of background for those who are not as familiar, Madagascar is the 4th largest island in the world. It's almost 600,000 square kilometers in terms of its landmass area. And it's known for extremely rich levels of biodiversity and a hyper-variable climate history that, as I mentioned before, extends back for thousands and thousands of years. The island itself sits off the coast of Eastern Africa, and it itself consists of a highly diverse set of different ecological biomes and environmental zones. And while new archaeological data continues to emerge that continues to challenge exactly when people first arrived here, it is pretty well established from a variety of different sources, archaeological, genetic, linguistic, etc., that different populations from around the world, consisting of Australasia, Asia, and East Africa, all contributed to what is today modern Madagascar or Malagasy culture. Both in terms of the people that arrived there and the introduction of different materials onto the island, including different plants, animals, ideas, technologies, etc., that arrived from all over this part of the world. While the earliest archaeological evidence is still inconclusive with where the first people exactly came from, when they arrived, where on the island they first set foot, and this remains a subject of intense debate today, we do know plenty, especially as we get, over the past 1,000 years or so, that we know people have been extensively living on Madagascar. So within my work specifically, I focus in the southwest of the island, which you'll see in this box here in green. This region is known as the Volundriac Marine Protected Area. And here you'll see a different map of it. And this area exists in what's known as the spiny thicket ecoregion of Madagascar. Madagascar has a variety of different ecological zones, and within this particular region, it's known for these basically shrub-like and xerophytic species that subsist in areas that for large parts of the year get little to no rainfall. Madagascar itself, though, is home to a very diverse set of communities. The people that live there, the native indigenous communities, are known as Malagasy. And this consists of a diverse set of sociolinguistic communities. So Malagasy is both the name of the people and also their language. Malagasy, there are dozens of different dialects, many of which are essentially unique languages. And the livelihoods of different communities throughout the island also vary. Subsistence was primarily rooted, for example, in rice agriculture and pastoralism in certain parts of the Central Highlands and further inland from the coast, whereas in the Volundriac area and other parts of the coastal southwestern region, fishing and foraging were primarily the modes by which communities subsisted and based their economies traditionally. Today, the work that I'm going to be talking to you about kind of focuses on and around this marine protected region, and it's home to about 7,000 to 10,000 people in over 30 different villages and consists of about 800 square kilometers of space. The communities that call this place home are known as the Vezu, and Vezu are basically a fishing community identity that is linked to maritime lifeways and marine resources. Vezu actually means to paddle when translated into English, which further emphasizes their connection with marine ecosystems and environments. And so kind of getting back into how this all plays out within the archaeology of the region, systematic investigations of the archaeology of the Volundriac region began really in about 2011 with the establishment of the Murumbe Archaeological Project, or MAP team, which was developed by my PhD advisor and current postdoctoral advisor, Dr. Christina Douglas. And MAP is this community-based archaeology organization that's run in association with Dr. Douglas's lab at Columbia University, and all the team members are local Volundriac community members who are trained as field archaeologists. All of this work now is also helping to, that the MAP team has been involved with, is helping to kind of further explore and understand exactly what people were doing here over time, when people first got here. And as I mentioned, the timing of when people first arrived is hotly debated. But more recent evidence that's been developed since the establishment of the Maroon Bay Archaeology Project, among many other researchers working on Madagascar for the past several decades, has started to basically reveal that people in, especially the region of Madagascar that Volundriac is located in, people have been living here for probably about the past 2,000 years. And there's a lot of evidence that suggests that. As we start to get more and more data, though, there's been some more recent information that suggests people may have been here much, much longer. However, these earliest dates are subject of intense debate. We don't entirely know when people first arrived, but additional evidence from domesticated animals that were introduced kind of all suggest that somewhere in this, 1,000 to 1,500 years ago, people arrived and were making significant changes to the landscape and kind of making it their own. And in addition to this, archaeological evidence from Volundriac kind of emphasize how connected to marine systems the local communities were and continue to be. The inhabitants of Volundriac have exploited a range of habitats, including coral reefs, mangroves, and intertidal zones, among many others, for at least 2 millennia, as evidenced by animal remains and faunal assemblages that have been excavated and studied. This graph just basically shows a breakdown of different species diversity in excavated assemblages, divided by the habitats in which these species originate. And it's clear that there's a wide variety of marine ecosystems that coastal communities took advantage of for subsistence. And more recently, work that I led with the MAP team for my dissertation has revealed a settlement system that was really driven by environmental and socio-political resources, and closely connected social networks of permanent and semi-permanent communities, which I'll really discuss more in a little bit later in this talk. But occupations in this region are usually found in one of 2 forms. Rock shelters, which are generally located within shallow cave or cavern systems, and then open air sites, which usually are remnants of coastal fishing camps and semi-permanent villages. Rock shelters to date tend to be the oldest, tentatively dating anywhere from about 1100 to 3000 BP, while open air sites tend to be more recent, dating somewhere in the past 200 to 1,000 years. So extensive survey efforts have led to the documentation of hundreds of archaeological sites along the coastline of Volundriac. And most of these sites were identified using satellite image analysis and predictive modeling efforts, which subsequently provided a massive data set which we can use to evaluate questions about resource exploitation patterns, settlement distributions, and the long-term ecological impacts of human activity on the landscape. Several excavations have also been carried out at sites throughout the region, including 8 new units that I helped to excavate with the MAP team during my dissertation work. And field work has revealed a plethora of evidence of marine ecosystem exploitation and a long history of fishing activities, evidenced from the massive diversity and volume of shell material that was recovered during both surveys and excavations, where we have a lot of marine resources that are distributed all throughout archaeological deposits on the surface, and also these kinds of features that we find when we dig into excavation units that evidence a long history of people subsisting off of marine environments. The archaeological record, when we couple this with things like oral histories and ethnographic information, present us with an area, a case study, where local communities have been exploiting marine resources for over a millennium, shifting foods and resource types when climatic and environmental conditions strained fishery production, and successfully managed these systems over many generations, periods of colonial and imperial rule and violence, political instability, and intense climate change. And so there are lessons we can learn from the history and archaeology of the Vesu fishers in this region about human management and use of marine ecosystems over long periods of time, and in the backdrop of climatic volatility. And so this is aided by the fact that these kinds of marine resource usage strategies persist into the present. Historical and ethnographic records demonstrate that There are different strategies that basic communities practice with regards to fishery use. Communities often move over the course of the year to exploit different resources and areas, giving different fisheries time to regenerate after fishing and harvesting of different materials has taken place. And so archaeological evidence, including that which I'll present to you and that I have talked about so far, kind of demonstrate that these kinds of practices can extend back hundreds, maybe even thousands of years. And so there are good contemporary and historic analogs to compare the archaeological record to in terms of how people were interacting with their ecosystems in the past and what we might be able to learn from those things moving forward. So today, I'm really going to focus on two major research questions that I've been asking throughout much of my research. And they both kind of revolve around the same kinds of questions, but from two different ends. The first is, how does the use of marine environments and the social networks that are surrounding these places, how do these change over time, especially within the context of shifting socio-political and climatic contexts? Here we're looking primarily at things like how rainfall has shifted, how the overall environmental conditions have changed, and what that does to the types of environments people are exploiting, and the ways in which people are connected throughout the region in a way that mitigates or extends the way in which people have used different resources over space. And the second question is, what are the long-term impacts and consequences that we see from coastal communities in terms of environmental legacy? In other words, how are people's decisions, the networks that are created, the types of resource exploitation patterns that are practiced, what are the long-term impacts of those decisions from hundreds to thousands of years ago on the modern environment today? And subsequently, what does this then tell us about sustainability and resilience of these traditional subsistence practices over time? So in order to answer these questions, I take a very interdisciplinary approach. So my work really combines a variety of different methods and theoretical perspectives from across the social, natural, computational sciences, and the humanities. And so this encompasses fields like anthropology, ecology, network science and machine learning, paleoecology and climatology, among others. And within the work that I'll be presenting to you today, I make use of a lot of these fields in a cohesive manner to try and derive as much information as I can about past resource use and its implications as possible. And so my colleagues and I have made use of social network analysis, which I'll present in probably one of the next slides, to kind of understand the ways in which people have connected with different communities to use different spaces and exploit different kinds of resources in different ways. We've also used paleoclimate reconstruction to try and map these settlement patterns across time and also with respect to how environmental conditions may have been changing. We also consult things like oral history records and ethnographic information to get a better sense for what people on the ground were experiencing at the time and trying to use that to explain what we're actually seeing in these archaeological records. And all of this is kind of situated within the broader use of remote sensing technologies, things like satellite imagery, machine learning analysis that helps us to build up bigger data sets to understand where people were living, how they were exploiting the land, and what the overall impact, especially in the modern ecosystem, has been for the places people have been exploiting for hundreds to thousands of years. And so this really brings us into one of the ways in which archaeologists can evaluate a lot of things in terms of social connectivity over time. And one of the things that archaeologists will do is we'll use things like pottery. So people decorate their ceramics in different ways depending on where you go. And what decades of archaeological research has shown is that the way that people decorate their ceramics and other things as well, not just ceramics, often relates to specific cultural traditions, modes of practice, or other contextually dependent activities that we can use to basically assign a group affiliation. So we can look at how someone decorated their home or decorated their pottery in this case, and we can understand perhaps who they were, who their community might have been. And so Madagascar is not an exception to this, and we actually can use ceramic technologies and decorative styles to evaluate connections between different community groups that had similar pottery and were potentially exchanging these kinds of ideas. And we can also use this to evaluate changes through time. As styles change, fads go in and out, we can actually kind of see this change across time and use the pottery to get a sense for when people were living in certain places. So using all of the data that was collected during field surveys, my collaborators and I basically began this in-depth investigation of how social networks changed in this area over the past 1,000 or so years using ceramics that were recovered from prior investigations. And we know that from paleoecological records and oral history documents that a lot of change was taking place. And so to kind of walk you through some of this a little bit right now, what you're looking at here is basically a record from a cave system located within the study region, which gives us a really good sense of the local climate conditions in Volundriac over the past 1,200 years. And what you'll see is anything in red is very, very dry, anything in blue is very wet. And you'll see that, in this earliest period that we have ceramic evidence for, the climate is changing from really, really dry conditions to kind of wet conditions and back and forth, but these conditions persist for centuries at a time. As we get more recent, in the past 300 to 500 years, it starts to get a little bit more jumpy, but you again have these sustained dry periods with some shifts towards wetter conditions, and then into the most modern period, it's prolonged dry. The second thing here, this record basically shows a more regional record. It comes from further south of our study region. And it also demonstrates that there's a lot of variability, although sometimes opposite to what we're seeing in the local conditions, but giving us the sense that the climate was not stable. There's a lot of periods that are shifting in terms of how much water would have been available, how much rain there would have been, how hot and how cold it might have, the conditions were. And this is also then coupled with evidence that we have from historical records, written records, and archaeological records. And so during these earlier periods when there's more variability, but sustained periods of dry or wet, it's fairly peaceful. We're seeing the emergence of the first villages. Exchange is quite abundant between coastal and inland communities. But as we get into these later, more recent timeframes, we get the emergence of things like the slave trade, intergroup warfare, colonialism, and polity formation. And as a result, you also see changes in how people are distributing themselves across the landscape, becoming a lot more concentrated for protection purposes. And this continues into the more recent times until the establishment of independence for Madagascar in the 1950s. What we can then do, though, is we can pair this with the archaeological record in terms of these ceramic network connections that we can examine from archaeological sites. And so when we look at this lined up, what we can start to see is that in the earlier period of time, over the past 1,100 to 500 years ago, you have this settlement system that is highly connected. And you'll note that most of the network is connected to itself. There aren't that many outliers that remain on their own, and people are kind of distributed all along the coastline, including around these very productive bay regions, which also contain mangrove forests and other things that were highly useful for food acquisition. And this again corresponds with these fairly predictable environmental conditions. They're sustained in terms of several hundred years of very dry conditions, then you get some wet conditions, but enough time for people to cope. As we get into this middle period, though, you'll notice that the network itself contracts. And this happens not just in this network graph here, but also spatially. People are kind of more concentrated along these more productive and also highly defendable locations, and you get a lot of fragmentation. Many sites are now abandoned or, disconnected from everybody else, suggesting that there is a shift taking place socially in terms of the people that are associating with other communities, which communities are allied or, actively engaging with one another, and the kinds of environments that they're inhabiting. And then as we move into the most recent period, which sees things like the slave trade continuing, but also ending, European colonialism, etc., you kind of get an expansion once again of lots of people all over the study region up and down the coastline, but you still retain a lot of these disconnected nodes, suggesting that mobility may have been restricted. Certain communities, because of the impacts of colonial conquest and environmental instability, may have had to permanently move and give up connections that they used to have. And so, what this kind of then demonstrates is we can see how these conditions, both socially and environmentally, are impacting where people are living and the kinds of places that they would therefore be exploiting for resources, food, etc. We can also use this, though, to get a better sense for food exploitation when we examine not just the patterns across the landscape that people are exploiting, but exactly what they're actually eating and using. So when we look in archaeological sites that we've excavated and have some good dates to compare, we can start to see the kinds of stuff that's going on. So for example, when we look in this early period, when we have fairly consistent conditions and whatnot, what you'll notice is that there are particular kinds of foods that exist, but they're not very prevalent. And these are what we would note as starvation foods. So from oral history records and ethnographic information, we know that there are certain kinds of marine species that coastal communities can eat. They're edible, but they're not preferred. People tend to avoid eating them if they have other choices. So when we start to see these kinds of species pop up in more and more abundance in archaeological assemblages, it does set off some alarm bells that there may have been something going on with the marine resources that were available at the time, suggesting shortages of other availability or something like that that would cause them to exploit these less popular food items. And so in this particular example, this site kind of dates between 600 and 300. So it goes between, it's kind of at the boundary when things start to go a little bit south in terms of climatic volatility. You'll notice that there's some use of these starvation foods, but in terms of the overall weight and the number of pieces, there's not that many of them. They're fairly rare, right? And these date to this rough time period. As we get into more modern times, though, where the climatic conditions are now sustained in terms of really, really dry, not necessarily conducive for certain, marine resources. What we start to wind up with are situations where these kinds of starvation foods become much more abundant. There's a lot more of them. There's a lot more usage of them throughout the units, meaning for long periods of time, as long as they were being occupied, people are now exploiting these starvation-based foods, suggesting that there may have been limitations placed on their ability to acquire other resources. Fisheries may have been experiencing downturn due to climate conditions, or people may have just simply been prohibited from accessing these places that they would have otherwise gone to. And so all of this kind of comes together to suggest that, the abilities of coastal communities to acquire suitable foods may have been limited by limitations placed on mobility, threats of violence. As we know, the slave trade was ongoing, state conquest was taking place, but there were also potential climatic fluctuations which would have impacted marine ecosystems and species abundance in certain places. So this kind of all helps to understand that first question that I posed earlier in the talk, which is, what are the patterns that we're seeing in terms of social connectivity and marine resource exploitation? But the second thing I was interested in addressing was to understand how people were managing these resources and what the legacy of human land use has been on these environments. And so to address this, what I did is I turned towards machine learning applications and satellite image analysis. And effectively what I was trying to do is see, is there a way using satellite imagery to quantify places on the landscape that people have been living on, so archaeological sites, and understand how that has potentially changed the very characteristics of soils, plants, and anything else that's living on those particular areas. Now, these kinds of studies have been done in many parts of the world before, but one of the limitations on Madagascar is that when it comes to archaeological sites, this is pretty much all you get. There's scatters of artifacts, but there's no buildings, there's no pyramids, there's no big monumental complexes that are easy to see from space. But so what I managed to do using a whole bunch of different satellites and methods is trained a machine learning algorithm to pick up on subtle differences that take place when people have lived in a place for a long period of time that change, organic matter in soil, the exact mineralogical composition of those soils, and subsequently certain characteristics about the plant life and other things taking place in the places that people have lived compared to places people have not been living on over time. And what we actually managed to do is pretty interesting. I'm not going to focus too much on this, but effectively, our method worked really well. An F1 score, you can think of it basically as an accuracy assessment. The closer this value is to 1, the more perfect your accuracy is. And our values were over 0.9. Basically, everything we fed the algorithm, it could repeat back to us, and it could also identify archaeological sites and places that were not archaeological that we had never shown it before. So it was performing really well. But what's really interesting about this isn't so much the technical aspects, although that's very interesting as well. It's what we can do with this information now that we have this large-scale map of where people have potentially modified their surroundings. And what this shows is a density diagram of where people were modifying their surroundings based on archaeological evidence. And what we can see is that the darker the red, the more modification took place. And so along the coasts where people are primarily exploiting coastal resources, there's less change really happening to the land itself, but we do see, especially in places that are nearby freshwater sources, mangrove forests, there's more densely modified locations resulting from human activity. And we also see this especially in places that we know are also home to pastoralist communities and lots of freshwater ponds that would have attracted a lot of people to live here, pretty sustained over long periods of time. And using this, we could also try and quantify the amount of land that was actually changed by people. And we ran this particular test on a subset of the study region, but of that area, about 17% of it was potentially modified by human activity. And again, these are modifications that were taking place anywhere from a couple of hundred to maybe even 800 to 1,000 years ago. And so it's showing us these cumulative impacts that people have when they live and exploit resources on a landscape over long periods of time that persist to today. And so ultimately, the question then arises with, well, now that we can see that people have modified these landscapes, what do these modifications actually look like? And so that's actually one of the things that I'm trying to investigate now in my postdoctoral research, which is trying to understand how different strategies of subsistence compare in terms of their ecological impact and overall sustainability in a region over time. To do this, it was again based on a lot of these satellite observations. What this image shows is the average change in an electromagnetic signature that we can record from archaeological sites across different groups of archaeological sites based on their main subsistence strategies. In other words, what it basically shows us is how much an area fluctuates in terms of its electromagnetic value across time. And each electromagnetic signature responds to different aspects of the environment. So in this case, we're looking at the green band of a satellite image, and green bands are generally used by remote sensing scientists to understand vegetation health and vegetative diversity. Effectively, the higher the reflectance is, the more vegetation is present in an area and the healthier that vegetation tends to be. This dotted green line basically represents our baseline. This is the average of places on the landscape that don't have any archaeological sites on them and how much they've changed over the course of a year. What you can see is that coastal communities overall, and fishing and foraging in particular, fluctuate a little bit more. They change a little bit more over the course of the year than non-archaeological sites do, but effectively stay about the same, and their fluctuations are effectively indicating slightly higher green values, more vegetation, or at least different kinds of vegetation that are growing in those places. This shows the red band, and the red is basically used to understand chlorophyll production, and also can be used to kind of separate moisture content. So the more reflectance you have, the more chlorophyll is being produced, the healthier a plant is going to be, and the less reflectance there is, the more there is water retention, because water absorbs all of this light. And what you can see is that the non-archaeological, so this quote unquote, non-anthropogenic baseline, there's a lot more fluctuation in this part of the electromagnetic spectrum over the course of many years than archaeological sites. So archaeological sites, places people have modified, are actually a lot more stable in terms of their water properties and vegetative health. And then when we look in the near infrared spectrum, which is a part of the electromagnetic spectrum that's really good at understanding water availability, vegetative health as well, among also things like soil properties, we again get this sense that fishing populations and foraging populations that were living along the coast are more stable across the year than places that people haven't been living in extensively. Coastal communities overall fluctuate a little bit more because we have things like more modern examples of agriculture and other industries that are taking place that were not necessarily fishing. But more or less, where people live, you get fairly consistent and fairly resilient environmental conditions. Now, some of this is a little bit more abstract, so to kind of put this a slightly different way, an NDVI is what's known as a vegetation index. So this is basically an algorithm using remote sensing instruments that tells us how healthy a vegetation is on a particular area. The higher the value is, the more healthy the vegetation. The lower the value is, the less healthy or less present vegetation is on a landscape. What you can see is, once again, these dotted lines represent what the non-archaeological baseline kind of tells us, and that when we have fishing and foraging communities, they're fluctuating less. So the vegetation is more consistent throughout the course of a year than in places without it. So it suggests that in almost every location, humans are very well integrated into their environments. They're playing central roles, and they're actually helping to maintain more stability in these ecosystems over time than places without human activities being present. So all of this is really, really interesting, because by examining how these kinds of traditional resource strategies are impacting modern ecosystems, we can kind of get a sense for how to improve efforts in the present that might also lead to these long-term solutions to providing stability to different ecological systems. So moving forward, one of the things that I'm involved with and trying to finally get off the ground because of delays from COVID is to back up all of these, observations that we have with a paleoclimate reconstruction project. So I'm currently helping to co-lead this collaborative project consisting of researchers from different institutions around the world that aims to improve our understanding of coastal and marine ecological conditions over the past 1,000 years or so using fossilized coral reefs. So Porites corals, which are these domed coral reefs that exist in many parts of the Indian Ocean, are really good at containing isotopic signatures and other traces that can be proxies for environmental and climatic conditions over time. And so what this project currently involves is researchers and the MAP team and other local community members in Volundriac to visit several coral locations off the coast of the Volundriac region that are within a lot of these coral systems and other fisheries that would have been exploited historically, and take cores of several of these coral reefs to relate climate events back to the settlement distributional patterns that we have from all this archaeological evidence to better understand the role that environmental change has on settlement distributions, but also the role that this climate change has explicitly on marine ecosystems. So everything that I presented to you today, the paleoclimate data all comes from terrestrial sources, things like caves, lake cores, etc. which are really good at getting a sense of what the terrestrial climate conditions are like, but it doesn't necessarily tell us exactly what was going on in the ocean and in the marine systems themselves, the places people were exploiting. So by taking cores from a variety of locations around our study region here, we can hopefully gather important information about the health and sustainability and resilience of these coral communities and other fishery locations for the past several hundred to maybe 1,000 years. And this kind of brings us towards the end of what I had planned to talk to you about today. But I wanted to just take a couple of minutes to try and tie everything I just talked about all together and frame it again back to what this tells us about sustainability. So we can probably boil a lot of what I just talked about into 3 major points. The first is that traditional fishing and foraging practices on Southwest Madagascar have crafted an ecological niche in the region that stretches back at least 600 to 1,000 years. And in all of this time, the human impacts on the landscape have become pronounced, but not really in negative ways. So for example, we're not seeing the places that people have lived are deforested, depleted of soil nutrients, etc. In fact, we actually see changes in positive ways where there's an abundance of nutrients for plants, available fresh water and soil retention, and resilience to seasonal shifts in climate. These kinds of things are really important because Madagascar has 2 very distinct seasonal climate conditions. You have a monsoon season for half the year, and you also have an extraordinarily arid period for the second half of the year where you get almost no rain. So by seeing that places that people are modifying actually retain water better is really important for survival during that really dry period of the year. The second thing is that we see that mobility is likely key to a lot of these traditional resource acquisition strategies. Populations were often moving between locations at different parts of the year, having social connections that expanded up and down the coast that could get at different particular resources that were needed at different times. And also, they would move up and down the coast to exploit different fisheries and sources that were more abundant at particular times of the year and leaving other areas to regenerate for future use. So because of this, the third major point is that a lot of modern policies that have been enacted by conservation agencies, governments, etc., have restricted a lot of people's movement in certain instances, and therefore could potentially be responsible in some ways for decreases in productivity or maybe lapses in how effective some of these conservation policies have been. And this isn't just relevant for coastal resources, but inland forest resources as well, where a lot of these policies are enacted for resource management or conservation, but don't engage with local communities or engage with traditional ecological systems. And as a result, they're not involving local stakeholders in these decisions. And a lot of these traditional practices are no longer able to be practiced in the same way. This can limit the utility of a lot of these strategies because they're ignoring a very key part of a lot of these ecosystems, which is people, which have been actively modifying these spaces in some ways in very sustainable ways over long periods of time. And with that, I just want to acknowledge the entire Morambe Archaeological Project team and the local communities that I've been working with over the past several years, and the variety of funding agencies that have allowed this work to take place. And with that, there hopefully it's time for some questions.
Thanks, Dylan. Wow, that was an amazing talk. That was such a superb talk. Absolutely wonderful stuff. Thank you so much for giving us that amazing and synthetic overview of how you bring everything together, different aspects. And your findings are so interesting and counterintuitive in many ways, but it's obviously really important as we think about resilience of these really fragile ecosystems. So questions are open. If anybody has any questions, please raise your hand or type a question. Oh, here we go. We have a question from Paolo Albano. Please go ahead, Paolo, if you can speak.
Hi, hello everybody.
Hi, Paolo.
Thank you so much for this very interesting talk. I'm Paolo Albano and I work at the Stazione Zoologica Anton Dohrn in Naples, in Italy. and I'm interested in the patterns of exploitation of marine resources by humans over multiple timescales. My question for you is, do you think that indeed the exploitation of intertidal to shallow water resources may have driven changes in the habitat preferences of some marine species over the last centuries to few millennia?
That's a really good question. I think it's entirely possible. So my work hasn't really focused directly on that particular topic, but I think there are other researchers who have been. But effectively, I mean, as people are exploiting certain places, obviously there are going to be subsequent feedback loops that take place. So it wouldn't surprise me to find out that in places that people are actively engaging with repeatedly, that may have changed certain patterns in which certain species would have flocked to or away from. But at the same time, there were often, usage strategies put in place, at least from ethnographic research that's been conducted, where people will go into an environment at a certain point in the year, kind of like, people will go and try and find that, okay, seals will flock to a certain location at particular times, or whales tend to always be found in a certain spot for mating seasons. So oftentimes what would happen is people would exploit a certain place at a particular time, get what they needed, and then leave. So it was kind of this cyclical motion where people would come and go. So I'm not sure that it would have necessarily impacted species prevalence in every location that this was taking place in, but I think it's certainly possible in certain circumstances, especially when resources may have been more constrained and people may have not been able to get to certain locations, and you start to see exploitation of resources that they weren't usually using. That's entirely possible, but it's a good question. It's certainly worthy of future considerations.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, Paolo, for your question. The questions are open. We have another 7 minutes before the hour, but we can also continue discussions if anybody wants to. Dylan, I have a question. So you're finding that the sites that have been inhabited by people have more stability, greater moisture content, more stable environmental conditions, greater terrestrial productivity than on average is a fascinating finding. I just wondered whether you had thought about potential mechanisms for that. One thing I'm really interested in is this idea of connectivity between the oceans and the land, which is clearly something that you're thinking deeply about. I'd love to have your thoughts on that. And I wondered whether, so often, where you find middens and accumulations of material, what you're seeing there is the movement of energy from the oceans onto the land, which would not normally have taken place, unless, for example, there are birds, fishing birds that would take marine resources and bring energy onto the land.
Right.
Do you think that humans may have been contributing to the enrichment of soils, or is that a potential mechanism of the movement of material from the oceans to the land? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think that's a really very interesting question, something I've thought about, but not necessarily as explicitly. So that was really good for helping frame some of the work as it moves forward, but definitely. So one of the mechanisms I think that's kind of taking place here is, as you said, people are taking from the oceans and other intertidal resources, bringing them onto the land. So we're finding, tons of shell material that wouldn't have really necessarily been there. We're finding, marine shells that are kilometers or miles inland. Shouldn't really be there unless people were taking them and transporting them. And with that, I mean, you have all these nutrients that can then leach back into the soils as those shells are left there for years and years. And in addition, just people living in a certain place, you have organic matter that just accumulates, which can also feed back into the ecological system. So I think that the simple act of, taking resources and moving them to a particular campsite or village location, and then eating and discarding of those resources, I think that's a very important mechanism that's taking place is just people's mobility and exploitation of different geographic locations, and then having some kind of central area that all of this is being brought back to. Additionally, though, I mean, we see this with other types of societies as well, with things like pastoralism. The cattle will go out and graze, and then sometimes there's dung deposits where now you can have a lot more productivity with cultivating crops and farming and whatnot, because you're recycling certain nutrients back into systems that they weren't present before. But in the context of these coastal areas, I think it definitely has to do with the the harvesting and then discarding of a lot of these organic materials into parts of the landscape that weren't there before. And as a result, you're getting these soils that now are mixed in with a lot more available nutrients that came initially from an intertidal zone or fishery.
Yeah, do you know, are there any seabirds in that region? Is it populated by seabirds? Is that another mechanism potentially of this movement from sea to land? You know?
I'm not 100% sure. There must be some, but I don't recall seeing a whole lot. But I will follow up on that. That is a good question.
It was great to see that you're interested in working on the corals as well. That's going to help you, look for that, find those into relationships between land and sea. Great.
Definitely.
Any more questions for Dylan? Please raise your hand or shout out. Oh, we do have a question come in.
Oh yeah, I see. So I was
This
wondering.
question is from Chiamaka. And they say, thank you very much for that enlightening talk, Dr. Dylan. I was wondering if there is a unique system of marine conservation practiced by the community in the past, and if it is still in practice today. Nice question.
That is a good question. So a lot of what we know about ancient or, marine conservation practices are really from the historical record and oral history documents. And we do know from ethnographic work and other things that have been conducted over the past 50 or 100 years or so, that oftentimes what would happen is at particular times of the year, Vesu fishers would pick up camp, and at least part of them would move up the coast or off to offshore islands that are abundant off the coast of Madagascar to fish for very particular kinds of things, whether they were sharks or a particular kind of fish that doesn't come closer to land, like pelagic fish. And then once that season was done, they would come back and they would go somewhere else. So it was really the strategy of mobility and, seasonally targeted fishing expeditions that would take place, that would kind of utilize both near shore and offshore resources, and at the same time also gathering things from terrestrial sources as well. There's also a balance in that capacity, and so that's kind of the traditional aspect of things. With the establishment of certain like marine reserves and stuff, some of this has been a little bit more limited, or at least decreased with the needs for permits and things to exploit a lot of these traditional locations, but it still is in many cases practiced to some degree today. And with a lot of this, it was recorded in research that was done only maybe 30 years ago. So a lot of this continues to persist, and we see evidence from the archaeological record that similar kinds of exploitation patterns were probably happening in more ancient contexts as well.
Thanks for the question and the answer, Dylan. That was great. We're on the hour, so it's maybe a good time to mention that you're welcome to leave. If there are any more questions, we could continue discussions. If you have another question, if you have time, Dylan, it's a simple question, maybe not so. I was really interested in your designation of your starvation foods, which I found really interesting. It's a great concept to isolate and designate taxa like that. I think it could give really nice insights into temporal changes and spatial changes in resource use. I was just wondering how you designated those taxa as starvation food. What criteria did you use to do that? I'm sorry if I missed that.
No, yeah. So this was, stuff that was, this notion of starvation foods really stems from ethnographic research. And so it's kind of based on a lot of interviews with traditional fishers and to an extent, oral history documents that kind of demonstrate what kinds of foods people were consistently eating, which kinds they kind of avoided, or the things that people knew were poisonous and couldn't be eaten. And so the notion of these starvation foods really stems from just observations and statements from people that were interviewed that, yeah, we don't eat those things if we can avoid it. And it's like almost self-designated in some way that like they're edible, but we'd prefer not to. It's kind of like, okay, it's the leftovers that have been in the fridge for, you know, several weeks. They're still edible, but we probably don't want to eat them. Not necessarily because they taste bad or anything, just there are other kinds of resources that are either more nutritious or just more abundant, something in that capacity that would have led other things to be more preferred, and these species kind of in the background. I don't know all of the rationale behind what made something a starvation food versus not, but at the very least, it was just personal preference or community level preference to eat certain things and leave others.
That's great, fascinating stuff. Dylan, thank you so much. That really was an absolutely terrific talk.
Thank you.
Congratulations on your research. It's superb. If you want to stay along around, Konstantina and I would just like to chat with you. But before everyone leaves, let's just thank Dylan again for his presentation for the Q-Mare working group. We really appreciate you giving us an insight into your research. And a couple of things before everyone goes. First of all, I want to remind you of that there is an upcoming Q-Mare working group meeting. It's the third working group meeting, and it will be held on January the 23rd and 24th of January. And the aim of this meeting is to essentially it's open to everyone to discuss, present on pre-industrial climates and their impacts on marine ecosystems. And the first day we'll focus on education. That's on the 23rd, and the second day on the 24th we'll be focusing on invited talks. And what I'll do is I'll send now into the chat a link where you can sign up to attend. Just go to that website and click the apply button. You'll find at the bottom, and you'll receive further information on how to attend the meeting. We'd love to see as many of you as possible in that meeting. Okay, and the second thing I just want to mention before we say goodbye is that the next seminar series will be held by Dr. Catalina Pimiento, and she will be talking about the ecological consequences of extinction. And presumably that's going to be the extinction of big things in the oceans, given what we know about Catalina's research. So look forward to that. That's going to be held on the 1st of February this year, and hopefully we'll have the link in order for that talk. And I apologize, Dylan, for the mess up with the link. But it looks like we had a good attendance, which was great. So thank you, Dylan. Again, thank you everyone for joining. See you next time. Bye.